The moon cast silver beams through the dense jungle, illuminating the massive German shepherd as it stood guard over something small, fragile, a baby. Alone, crying, wrapped in rags. But in the distance glowing eyes, something was watching, waiting. The dense jungle pulsed with life. Towering trees stretched endlessly toward the sky, their gnarled roots clawing at the damp earth. Vines draped like ancient tapestries, whispering with the wind, and in the distance, the haunting cries of unseen creatures echoed in the thick, humid air. Yet, despite the jungle's wild heart, one figure stood still, a dog, a magnificent German shepherd, its deep brown eyes locked onto something impossibly small beneath the tangle of leaves. Max had never belonged here. He was bred for luxury, raised in a penthouse where the skyline stretched far beyond his comprehension. His owner, Henry Caldwell, was a man of wealth, a self-made billionaire whose fortune was built on towering hotels and endless stretches of pristine real estate. Henry had everything except time. He was always moving, always chasing something invisible, something more. Max had been a gift, a well-trained companion meant to fill the void of an empty mansion. But he was more than just a pet. He was Henry's shadow, his silent confidant during lonely nights when the weight of a past he never spoke of crept in. There was something about the dog's presence, steady, unwavering, that anchored Henry in ways even he didn't understand. But tonight Max was alone. Henry had brought him on what was meant to be a simple retreat, a getaway to an exclusive, untouched island, his latest investment. The billionaire had promised himself that this time he would slow down, breathe. But fate had different plans. A storm had torn through their camp 2 nights ago, and in the chaos, Max had run. Something in the wind had called to him a scent, a sound, something ancient and instinctual. He had disappeared into the jungle, following a path unseen by human eyes, drawn by something deeper than thought. And now, here he stood, ears perked, muscles tense, breath slow and measured. At his feet, hidden beneath the shelter of a fallen branch, lay something fragile, a baby. Its tiny fists trembled in the cool night air, its skin bruised by the elements, its cries hoarse, almost lost against the symphony of the jungle. Max lowered his nose, sniffing gently, his warm breath brushing against the child's damp cheek. A distant growl rumbled through the trees. Max's ears flicked back, and his body stiffened. The jungle was watching, expanding on the protagonist's present struggles. Far away, Henry sat beneath the broken remains of a makeshift shelter, staring at the dying embers of a fire. His phone, useless without signal, lay discarded beside him, and in his hands he turned over something small and worn, a silver locket. Inside, the picture of a woman long gone, and beside her, a child. Henry swallowed hard, pressing the locket shut with a quiet click. He had spent years running from ghosts, building walls made of steel and glass, filling his life with noise and transactions, anything to drown out the silence. But silence had found him here. And now, Max was gone. Henry had searched endlessly, calling through the jungle, his voice swallowed by the vast green abyss. Max wasn't just a dog. He was the last piece of something Henry had lost, a connection to a past he had buried beneath contracts and acquisitions. And now, the only thing that had ever truly stayed by his side had vanished into the unknown. Another gust of wind rustled the trees, carrying a sound too distant to be real. A child's cry. Henry frowned, standing slowly, his tired limbs protesting. He strained his ears, but the jungle had already swallowed the sound. Perhaps it was nothing. A trick of the wind, the call of some strange bird. But something gnawed at his gut, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Somewhere out there, beneath the endless canopy of shadows, Max stood guard over the impossible life left behind, abandoned, just as Henry had once abandoned his own past. And the jungle was waiting. The jungle was never silent. Even in the stillness of the night, it breathed, alive with rustling leaves and distant, primal murmurs. Max remained motionless, his keen ears flicking at every sound, his body tense as he crouched over the tiny form beneath him. The baby stirred weakly, its small fingers grasping at nothing, its lips parting in silent exhaustion. Max didn't know what human words meant, but he knew life when he saw it, and this child was clinging to it by a thread. A sharp snap echoed through the trees. Max's head jerked up. His instincts screamed, but he did not run. Instead, he positioned himself over the child, pressing his body lower, shielding it from the unseen threat lurking beyond the trees. The growl came again, low and guttural. Not distant this time, closer. Yellow eyes flickered through the brush, slithering between the shadows. A predator, watching, waiting. The jungle was not forgiving. It did not take pity on the weak. This child should not have survived the night, and yet Max bared his teeth, his growl a low vibration that rumbled from deep in his chest. He had never fought before. In his old life, in the towering halls of luxury, the worst he had ever faced was a locked gate or the click of Henry's impatient fingers. But this was different. The jungle did not care that he belonged to a man who owned islands. It only knew the language of hunger. The creature in the brush moved, slow and deliberate, each step calculated. Max could hear its breathing, steady, unhurried. He knew this game. A predator did not rush. It let fear do the work. But Max did not fear. The beast lunged, a streak of muscle and teeth. Max met it head-on, twisting his body at the last second, his jaws snapping at the empty air where its throat had been a moment before. Claws raked his shoulder, sending white-hot pain through his side, but he did not yield. A battle in the dark, a test of survival. Behind him, the baby whimpered a tiny sound, barely audible over the chaos. But it was enough. Max's vision sharpened, his muscles coiled, and with a sudden, brutal force he struck. His teeth found purchase, sinking deep into the predator's shoulder, a sharp yelp, a violent struggle, blood on his tongue. The beast scrambled back, its glowing eyes burning with something beyond hunger, now respect perhaps, or recognition. Max did not move as it slunk back into the jungle, its wounded pride retreating with it. Only when he was sure the danger had passed did he turn back to the baby, nudging it gently with his nose. The child stirred, still alive, still breathing, but barely. Max licked at the child's damp forehead, tasting salt and fear. He had to move. The jungle had tested them once. It would test them again. And the night was far from over. Raising the stakes, building suspense. Henry hadn't slept. He had spent the last few hours wandering the jungle's edge, calling for Max, his voice breaking against the dense wall of trees. His flashlight flickered, the batteries nearly drained, but he kept going. He didn't know why. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something else, something heavier, something clawing at the edges of a past he didn't want to remember. The locket in his pocket felt heavier than usual. Another step, another breath. Then, a sound. Not the usual hum of insects or distant bird calls. This was something else, something human. A cry. Henry froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. For a moment, he doubted himself. The jungle was a trickster. It whispered and deceived. But then again, a cry, faint but real. He moved without thinking. The jungle swallowed him whole, vines tugging at his clothes, the ground shifting beneath his unsteady steps. His pulse roared in his ears. And then he saw it. Max! Standing in a small clearing, his fur matted with blood, his body curled protectively over something small. A baby. For the first time in years, Henry's breath caught in his throat. What the hell? He dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached out. The baby whimpered, its tiny chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Henry's mind raced, but no answer came. Who? How? He pressed his fingers against the child's cheek, cold. Too cold. Max whined softly, nudging Henry's hand toward the child as if urging him to move. And for the first time in his life, Henry didn't hesitate. He scooped the baby into his arms, holding it against his chest. Max rose to his feet, standing beside him, his body still tense, still on guard. Henry followed his gaze toward the darkness beyond the clearing. The jungle was still watching. And something was out there. The true threat emerges. Henry's breath came fast, shallow. The weight of the child in his arms felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just the exhaustion. It wasn't just the fear. It was something deeper, something clawing at his chest, making it hard to breathe. "Come on, buddy," he whispered to Max. "Let's get out of here." Max didn't move. His ears were pinned back, his body coiled like a spring. Henry followed his gaze again deeper into the trees. Then he saw them. Not one, not two. 3 pairs of glowing eyes. Watching. They were not like the first predator. These moved differently coordinated, patient. Hunting together. Henry's grip on the baby tightened. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The jungle was shifting around him, the trees whispering secrets he wasn't meant to hear. Max growled low, steady. A challenge. One of the creatures stepped forward, sleek, powerful. Its muscles rippled beneath its dark fur, its teeth glinting beneath the thin strands of moonlight that cut through the trees. Henry swallowed hard. They weren't getting out of this without a fight. The first predator had been testing them. But now, the real hunt had begun. Henry's pulse pounded against his temples as he stood frozen in the thick, suffocating air of the jungle. The three pairs of glowing eyes didn't waver. They weren't afraid. They had been watching, waiting, and now they were ready. The baby stirred in his arms, a small whimper escaping its cracked lips. A sound too weak to be a cry, but just enough to remind Henry that there was no room for hesitation. Run. The thought slammed into his brain, but his body didn't move. Max stood at his side, fur bristling, his growl steady like the low hum of a distant storm. His wound from the earlier attack had stopped bleeding, but Henry could see the stiffness in his movements. He was hurt, and there were three of them. The lead predator, a panther, sleek and silent, stepped forward, its golden eyes locked onto Henry, unblinking. Behind it, two others flanked its sides, their bodies moving in perfect unison, muscles coiled, waiting for the moment to strike. Henry had no weapon, no knife, no gun, nothing but Max, the baby, and the raw instinct of a man who had spent his life fighting boardroom battles, not jungle warfare. And yet, for the first time in his life, Henry wasn't thinking about himself. The jungle had never been his enemy. He had spent years conquering land, building towers from dirt, turning forests into profits. But the jungle did not forgive. It did not bow to wealth. Tonight, the jungle was deciding whether he lived or died. And it wasn't just him. The panther took another step, its shoulders rolling like liquid shadow. Its gaze flickered to the baby. It knows. The realization hit Henry like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just an attack. This was hunger. The predators had watched Max defend the child. They had smelled its weakness, its helplessness. It was prey. Henry's breath caught, his grip tightening. He took a single step back, and the jungle exploded. The panther lunged. Max leapt. Henry barely had time to react as the two forces collided. A snarl ripped through the air, followed by the sickening sound of teeth sinking into flesh. Max's body twisted mid-air, his jaws snapping around the panther's throat, but the other two were already moving. One veered toward Henry. There was no time to think. He turned, running blindly, his legs heavy, his breath ragged. The baby pressed against his chest, its warmth a fragile contrast to the icy terror flooding his veins. Branches clawed at his arms, roots threatened to trip him, but Henry ran. Behind him, Max's growls turned to yelps. Henry clenched his jaw. Don't stop. The predator behind him was fast. He could hear its breath, feel the heat of its body closing in. It would reach him. It would tear into him before he could take another 10 steps. And the baby, a rock. Jagged, heavy. Henry lunged for it, twisting just as the predator leapt. He swung blindly. The impact rattled up his arm, bone-jarring, splitting pain. But the force was enough. The predator let out a sharp yowl, staggering back. Henry didn't wait. He ran. Through the trees, through the dark, through the never-ending maze of green and shadows and hunger. Then, a drop. He saw it too late. The ground disappeared beneath him, and he fell. Air rushed past Henry's ears, his body twisting as he tumbled down the steep incline. He curled himself around the baby, instinct overpowering pain as branches scraped his arms, rocks slammed against his ribs. The world was a blur of darkness and movement. Then impact. His back hit the ground, hard. The wind ripped from his lungs. He gasped, his vision swimming, pain tearing through every nerve in his body. Silence. For a moment he couldn't move. The jungle loomed above him, the incline steep, unreachable. The predator was gone, at least for now. But Max, Henry groaned, forcing himself onto his side, his muscles screaming in protest. He lifted the baby weakly, cradling it against his chest. Still breathing. Thank God. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the sliver of sky visible through the canopy. The realization settled like a stone in his gut. Max had stayed behind. He had fought for Henry, for the baby, and Henry had run. A sharp pang tore through him, deeper than the bruises, sharper than the wounds. He had always run. From responsibility, from regret, from everything that ever required more of him than money could buy. Now, he was here, at the bottom of a ravine holding a child that didn't belong to him, in a jungle that had never belonged to him. And Max was alone. Henry let out a shuddering breath, gripping the locket around his neck. The weight of it felt unbearable. The past was repeating itself. A memory surfaced, unbidden. A hospital room. A woman's tired eyes. A child's heartbeat on a monitor. His child. She had been small like this baby, fragile, but he hadn't stayed. He had let go. Because that was what Henry Caldwell did. He let go. A rustling above him. Henry tensed. His body screamed for rest, but his mind roared in defiance. He pushed himself up, cradling the baby close. Something was moving. Not a predator. Something different. A figure. Human. Henry's breath caught. Who the hell was out here? Then a voice. Low. Cautious. Put the baby down. Henry's heart slammed into his ribs. The figure stepped forward. A man. Weathered, his clothes torn, his skin darkened from the sun. A rifle slung over his back. His eyes flickered to the child. Henry tightened his grip. Who are you? The man didn't answer. His gaze never left the baby. And then, in a voice edged with something Henry couldn't place, he whispered, "That child isn't supposed to be here." Henry's breath stopped. The words cut through the night, heavier than the silence that followed. The jungle had given them a moment to breathe. But the true danger had only just begun. Henry's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as he followed the stranger through the tangled undergrowth of the jungle. The child in his arms barely stirred now, its tiny body too cold, too weak. His arms ached, his ribs screamed from the impact of his fall, but he didn't loosen his grip. The man ahead of him moved effortlessly through the shadows, his boots barely making a sound against the damp earth. Henry didn't know if he could trust him. Hell, he didn't even know his name. But he had no choice. The jungle was alive around them, whispering in the darkness. In the far distance, a low growl echoed a reminder that they weren't alone. That danger still lurked, waiting for the moment they let their guard down. The man glanced over his shoulder, his sharp eyes flickering toward Henry. "You're slowing down." Henry tightened his jaw. "Maybe because I just fell off a damn cliff." The man gave a quiet snort but didn't stop. "If you want that child to survive, you need to move faster." Henry exhaled sharply, adjusting his grip on the baby. He felt the slight rise and fall of its tiny chest, each breath more fragile than the last. "How do you know about this child?" Henry asked, his voice low. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed aside a thick curtain of vines, revealing a narrow, almost invisible pathway leading deeper into the jungle. He motioned for Henry to follow before finally speaking. "I don't," he admitted, "but I know what happens to children who are left here." Henry swallowed, the weight of the words settling deep into his chest. He didn't want to ask. He didn't want to hear the answer, but he forced himself to. "What happens?" The man stopped walking. He turned, his face partially lit by a sliver of moonlight breaking through the dense canopy. "They disappear." The silence between them was thick, suffocating. The jungle around them pulsed with unseen life, but Henry barely noticed. His grip on the baby tightened. "Disappear?" he repeated, his throat dry. "What the hell does that mean?" The man studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether he was worth the truth. Then, with a slow exhale, he spoke. "There's a reason predators don't go near this child," he said quietly. "They're afraid of something worse." A cold shiver ran down Henry's spine. The man turned and kept moving, forcing Henry to follow. Every step felt heavier, every shadow more menacing. They walked for what felt like hours, though Henry knew it couldn't have been that long. The jungle twisted around them, an endless maze of green and black, each path identical to the last. And then, suddenly, they were there. A clearing. At first, Henry didn't register what he was seeing. It was too unexpected. A house. Not just any house. a structure hidden deep in the jungle, barely visible beneath the heavy vines and moss that had claimed its walls. It was old, the wood worn and cracked, but the sight of it was so out of place that Henry felt a strange sense of unease settle over him. The man walked toward it without hesitation. "What is this place?" Henry asked. "A place that shouldn't exist," the man muttered. Henry hesitated at the threshold. The baby let out a small, broken whimper in his arms. An instinct overrode fear. He stepped forward. Inside, the air was thick, stale. The house was barely furnished, only a few scattered pieces of old furniture covered in dust and neglect. But there was something else. Something wrong. Henry's eyes scanned the room, and then he saw it. A crib. An old wooden crib pushed against the far wall, covered in dust and vines, as if it had been abandoned years ago. Henry felt his pulse spike. "What the hell is this?" The man didn't answer. He walked to a wooden chest in the corner, kneeling beside it before slowly lifting the lid. Henry took a step closer, peering over his shoulder. Inside were blankets. Tiny, faded blankets, and beneath them, Henry's stomach turned. Tiny shoes. Dozens of them. He staggered back, his breath coming fast, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. This isn't—" His voice trailed off, unable to find the right words. The man stood slowly, his expression unreadable. "This is what happens to the children who are left behind," he said softly. Henry's grip on the baby tightened, his entire body going rigid. This wasn't just a coincidence. This baby, whoever had left it in the jungle, had meant for it to never be found. The realization hit Henry like a punch to the gut. He thought about Max, about how the dog had sensed something was wrong, how he had found the child and refused to leave. Max had known. And now Henry did too. He turned to the man, his jaw clenched. "Who are you?" The man met his gaze, his expression grim. "The only person who knows the truth." Henry's breath was shallow, his mind racing. If that was true, if this man knew what was really happening here, then that meant one thing. They weren't safe. Not yet. And one was still out there, waiting for the child to be lost again. Henry's grip on the baby tightened, his mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. The wooden crib, the tiny shoes, the eerie emptiness of the jungle-shrouded housenon of it made sense. And yet, it all made perfect, horrifying sense. This baby wasn't just abandoned. It was meant to disappear. The man beside him, silent, unreadable, closed the wooden chest and stood, brushing dust from his hands. His gaze flickered toward Henry, then toward the shadows pressing against the windows. "We need to move," he said. "Now." Henry hesitated. His legs felt like lead, his body stiff from exhaustion and pain. But the look in the man's eyes, the urgency, the certainty shoved him forward. "What's out there?" Henry demanded as they stepped back into the thick jungle. "Who left this baby here?" The man didn't answer right away. He moved fast, his steps confident despite the uneven terrain. Henry struggled to keep up, cradling the baby as he stumbled over roots and slick moss-covered stones. Then, finally, "There are things in this jungle worse than predators." Henry swallowed hard. The weight of those words pressed against his ribs like a vice. The night around them felt different now, heavy, watchful. Max. The realization slammed into him like a brick. Max was still out there. He skidded to a halt, his breath ragged. "We have to go back." The man spun to face him, his expression unreadable. "What?" "My dog fought to protect this baby. I ran, I left him." Henry's voice cracked, thick with guilt. "I can't." A sound sliced through the jungle. A slow, deliberate crack of a branch. Henry's pulse slammed against his ribs. The man inhaled sharply. "We're not alone." The jungle, once an overwhelming cacophony of life, had gone still. The insects, the distant hoots of unseen creatures, all of it swallowed by an unnatural silence. Then, footsteps. Not rushed, not panicked. Slow, purposeful. Henry's throat tightened. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You need to listen to me. Keep moving. Do not stop. Do not." A voice cut through the darkness. "You shouldn't have taken it." Henry's blood turned to ice. The voice was calm, collected, and close. The man's entire body tensed. From the trees, a figure emerged. A woman. She was dressed in dark clothing, her presence almost blending into the jungle itself. Her face was unreadable, her expression disturbingly neutral. But her eyes, dark, unblinking, were locked onto the child in Henry's arms. Henry took a step back. His grip on the baby tightened. The woman tilted her head slightly. "You don't understand what you've done." Henry's breath came fast and shallow. "Who are you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she took a slow step forward. The ground barely made a sound beneath her feet. "That child," she said, her voice smooth as glass, "was never meant to leave this place." Henry's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" The man beside him, still poised, spoke for the first time. "She's one of them." The woman's expression didn't change. She simply exhaled, slow and measured. "This isn't your fight," she said. "Walk away. Leave the child." Henry's mind reeled. "That's not happening." The woman sighed, not in frustration, not in anger, in pity. "That's unfortunate." Then, the jungle moved. Shadows erupted from the trees. More figures, more people, silent, unseen until now, surrounding them, trapping them. Henry's pulse roared in his ears. He turned, his back against the man's. The baby let out a weak, whimpering cry. And then, from the darkness, a growl. Low, dangerous. "Max." Henry's chest constricted. The dog emerged from the undergrowth, his fur matted, his body bruised and bleeding but standing tall. His teeth bared, his body coiled, ready to strike. A silent command passed between them. "Not today." The woman's lips parted slightly. For the first time, a flicker of emotion passed through her expression. Annoyance. "Kill them." The jungle erupted. Max lunged first. The chaos that followed was a blur of movement, of desperate action, of instinct clawing its way to the surface. Henry barely had time to react before one of the figures charged at him. He twisted, shielding the baby, his free arm coming up in defense. A hand grabbed his shoulder too strong, too fast, but before it could yank him down, the man beside him struck. A flash of a blade, a muffled cry. The grip on Henry vanished. "Run!" the man barked. Henry didn't hesitate. He turned, crashing through the jungle, Max at his side. The baby in his arms whimpered, its tiny body weak, exhausted. Branches whipped against his face. Roots threatened to trip him. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit, the snap of twigs, the heavy rush of bodies tearing through the undergrowth. The river. It was their only chance. He pushed forward, lungs burning, every muscle in his body screaming. Then a gunshot. The sound tore through the night. Henry flinched, his steps faltering. He twisted just in time to see the man behind him stumble, blood blooming across his shoulder. Another gunshot. Max let out a sharp yelp, his body jerking. "No!" Henry skidded to a halt, his chest heaving. He turned back, panic surging through his veins. "Max!" The dog was down, but still moving, still fighting. Henry made a choice before his brain could stop him. He turned back. He ran toward Max, his heart hammering against his ribs. The woman watched him with unreadable eyes. "You should have kept running," she murmured. Henry didn't care. He reached Max, his hands shaking as he pressed them against the dog's fur. "We're not done," he whispered. "Not yet." Max whined, but his eyes sharp, unwavering, locked onto Henry's. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. Henry rose. His body ached. His vision swam. But he stood. The figures around him hesitated. And in that moment, Henry realized something. They weren't invincible. They bled. They hesitated. They feared. And so, with nothing left to lose, Henry took a breath and charged. The night bled into dawn, the first slivers of light cutting through the jungle canopy. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, blood, and something older, something darker. Henry's body ached, his limbs heavy, his breath raw and uneven. But he was still standing. Max lay at his feet, battered but alive, his breath coming in slow, measured pants. Henry knelt beside him, running a hand through the dog's matted fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his fingers. Relief washed over him like a wave. The attackers were gone. The woman, the one who had spoken with such chilling certainty, had vanished into the jungle with the others, retreating as quickly as they had come. Whether they had been driven away by fear or something else, Henry didn't know. And he didn't care. Because the baby, the fragile, helpless child he had fought so hard to protect, was still here, still breathing. Henry sat back against the base of a massive tree, cradling the child in his arms. The infant's tiny chest rose and fell in steady, peaceful rhythm, oblivious to the horrors of the night. Somewhere deep inside, something in Henry cracked open. For so long he had run, from responsibility, from connection, from the ghosts of his past that whispered his failures in the dead of night. But now he had something worth holding on to. Max whined softly, shifting his weight to rest his head against Henry's leg. Henry scratched gently behind the dog's ear, a silent promise passing between them. They had made it. But the fight wasn't over. Henry lifted his gaze toward the trees, where the jungle stretched endlessly in all directions. He couldn't stay here. They needed to get out. The man, the one who had fought alongside him, who had taken a bullet to protect them, sat a few feet away, clutching his wounded shoulder. His face was pale, but his expression remained unreadable. "You're still alive," Henry muttered. The man huffed out a breath, his lips curling into the ghost of a smile. "Barely." Henry glanced down at the child in his arms. "I need to get this baby to safety." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "There's a village, a few miles south. If we keep moving, we'll reach it by midday." Henry exhaled. It wasn't much, but it was enough. With a grunt of effort, he pushed himself to his feet, every muscle in his body protesting the movement. Max stood too, albeit slower, his movements stiff but determined. Henry adjusted the baby in his arms, holding the child close to his chest. "Let's go." The man nodded, and together they stepped forward, leaving the ghosts of the jungle behind. Hours later, the village appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a scattering of small wooden houses nestled between rolling hills and a winding river. Smoke curled from chimneys, the scent of burning wood thick in the crisp morning air. Henry's legs nearly gave out at the sight. People. Safety. A way out. The man beside him grunted, "Told you it was real." Henry didn't respond. He simply kept walking, his body fueled by sheer will. Max stayed close to his side, his ears pricked forward, his body tense. As they neared the edge of the village, a figure stepped forward. An older woman, her lined face shadowed beneath the brim of a wide straw hat. Her sharp eyes flickered over them, taking in their ragged forms, the blood, the exhaustion. And then her gaze settled on the child. She inhaled sharply, stepping closer. "Where did you find that baby?" Henry hesitated. "In the jungle." Something in her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition, of horror. She turned, calling out in a language Henry didn't understand. More villagers emerged from their homes, murmuring, their eyes wide with something between awe and fear. The woman turned back to Henry. "Come inside," she said. "Quickly." Henry didn't argue. He followed her into a small, warm house, the scent of herbs and old wood filling his lungs. She motioned for him to set the baby down on a woven blanket near the fire. Henry did so carefully, his fingers lingering against the child's fragile skin. The woman knelt beside the baby, pressing her palm gently to its tiny chest. A shuddering breath left her lips. "This child," she murmured, "was never meant to leave that jungle." Henry stiffened. "What do you mean?" She looked up at him, her eyes dark with something ancient. "There are stories," she said, "legends, about children who are chosen." Henry's pulse pounded. Chosen for what? She hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "For sacrifice." The world tilted. Henry's hands curled into fists. "That's not possible." The woman met his gaze, unflinching. "It is." Henry swallowed hard, his mind racing. The abandoned crib, the tiny shoes, the figures in the dark, the woman in the jungle, telling him to leave the child behind. It all made sense now. This baby had been left in that jungle for a reason, not out of neglect, not out of desperation, but as an offering. Henry's stomach turned. He looked down at the child, small, innocent, unaware of the fate it had narrowly escaped. Not this time. Not ever. He exhaled sharply, lifting his gaze back to the woman. "Can you help?" She studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, "Yes." Relief crashed through him, leaving him weak. The baby would be safe. It was over. Or at least this part was. Henry knelt beside Max, resting his forehead against the dog's. "We did it, buddy." Max let out a soft huff, pressing closer. For the first time in his life, Henry didn't feel like running. For the first time, he had something worth staying for. Some choices change us forever. Henry stepped into that jungle a man burdened by regret and isolation, but he emerged with purpose, with a reason to fight, with something to protect. What would you have done in his place? Would you have turned back, walked away, or would you have fought for something greater than yourself? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable tales. Because sometimes, the smallest lives leave the biggest impact. And sometimes, heroes come with 4 legs and a heart of gold.